Welcome back to Book Break. In this video I'm going to recommend you a bunch of feminist classic books for your collection. I've got a mixture of fiction and non-fiction on this list. Let's start with some non-fiction. Let's go back to the roots of feminism. A book that's considered one of the first works of feminist philosophy is Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft. So this one was published in 1792, and in this book Wollstonecraft argued for women's right to an education and advocated for women as essential to the nation, which we are. So that's considered one of the first works, but actually around the same time, and in fact a year earlier, the French writer Olympe de Gouges wrote her own Feminist Manifesto called Declaration of the Rights of Women, and Olympe de Gouges is also one of France's first public opponents to slavery. So works like that are kind of considered to have kick-started the feminist movement, but it was of course a very limited feminist movement at that time. So less than 100 years later, Sojourner Truth delivered the speech that we now know as Ain't I a Woman at the Women's Convention in 1851. And that inspired Bell Hooks' book of the same name, Ain't I a Woman, which is this groundbreaking book that came out in the 80s all about how the feminist movement had for so long ignored women of colour and poor women, and therefore was just reinforcing sexism and classism and racism. Audre Lorde then continued this theme with her essay collection Sister Outsider, which is all about articulating the struggles of marginalised groups. And the most famous essay from that collection is The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. Essentially, in order to bring about any real change, we can't do it while staying within the patriarchal, racist framework that we live in now. And then Paula Gunn Allen was a Native American author whose book The Sacred Hoop is a really good introduction to Indigenous feminist thought and really brings the role of Indigenous women back to the forefront of Indigenous traditions, contrary to the depictions of Indigenous societies that have been created by the European colonisers. Then going way back in time, Chandrabhati's Ramayan was written in the 16th century by Chandrabhati, the first famous female Bengali poet, and it's a retelling of the Ramayana, that ancient Indian epic, but told from the point of view of Sita. And it really subverts traditional ideas of obedience and chastity. So that was kind of a very quick whistle-stop tour through some big works of feminist philosophy. If you like reading feminist philosophy, there is of course also The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, which is a very famous work where we get the quote from "One is not born but becomes a woman." There's also The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, which is credited with sparking second wave feminism, and Gender Trouble by Judith Butler, which completely disrupts traditional ideas of binary sex and gender. But if instead of works of philosophy you prefer reading people's personal stories, there are loads of classic feminist memoirs. So for example, I've got here The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. So this is a memoir that's inspired by the stories Maxine Hong Kingston's mother told her when she was a child of her experience growing up in a China that wasn't very kind to women, and then this contrasted with Kingston's experience of growing up in an America that wasn't very kind to immigrants. And the book is also very inspired by Chinese myth and folklore. Man into Woman by Lily Elbe is widely thought to be the first ever work of trans literature. So this is the memoir of Lily Elbe, a Dutch painter who is also the subject of the movie The Dutch Girl. Elbe was one of the first people ever to undergo sex reassignment surgery, as we now know it as gender confirmation surgery, back in the 30s when it was still a very experimental and unsafe procedure, and tragically she did die from complications from one of the surgeries. But in the memoir, we really get to follow her personal story and see her initial sorrow and confusion in life turning to nothing but happiness and confidence once she discovered her true self. I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou is the first of 7 volumes that Maya Angelou wrote of her autobiography spanning her whole life. This first book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, covers the period from when she's 3 years old to when she's 16 and becomes a mother. So the book contains lots of critiques of racism, as the whole series does, but this one is also really a celebration of black girlhood and black motherhood. And I've got one more memoir before we move to fiction. This is The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands by Mary Seacole. So Mary Seacole was a Jamaican nurse who left her home to offer her support as a nurse to the British troops during the Crimean War, something that was initially refused. And in fact, Seacole experienced a lot of racism throughout her time living in Britain. But undeterred, she went on to set up her now famous hotel offering support to wounded British soldiers. But even despite her invaluable contributions, she still returned home at the end of the war penniless and unrecognised, and it took a long time for her achievements to really be celebrated. But this is her autobiography. Okay, let's move to fiction. So having shown you The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole, I have got 3 more books in this MCL collection. These books are all so gorgeous, so you can start a nice little feminist book collection on your shelf. Let me go through these fiction books. Prelude and Other Stories is a collection of short stories by Catherine Mansfield, a New Zealand author who wrote particularly brilliantly about women and women's sexuality and female identity. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a very famous feminist short story about a woman forced to undergo the rest cure, which leads to this descent into madness. And it's a story so scary it can actually be read as a horror story. But this book also includes the story Herland, which is about a feminist utopia made up only of women. And then there's The Awakening and Other Stories by Kate Chopin. So The Awakening is a novella that completely scandalised readers at the time it was published. It's about a married woman having an affair, something that was completely shocking at the time. It's no longer seen as quite so monstrous, but the story is still really gripping and so perfectly captures the psychological state of this woman trapped in a really stifling marriage and discovering her own sexuality. So, gorgeous little feminist collection here. I also have another set of classics that I collect. These are my Persephone Classics. So this is a bunch of more really feminist classics. I love the way they all look together too. I'm just going to tell you about this top one. This is The Homemaker by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. So this is about a husband and wife in the 20s who swap the traditional gender roles after the husband is injured and can no longer go to work. So the wife goes out and gets a job instead, and the husband stays home and looks after the children, and they find that they are both much happier in their new roles. Again, something not considered particularly scandalous or shocking today, but I absolutely loved this book. It's such an interesting questioning of the gender roles of the time. And a lot of questions that are still relevant today. Another very famous feminist classic is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This is a very, very sad book about a young black girl called Paula who wishes to have blue eyes because she wants to be as well loved as the blonde blue-eyed children that she sees. The book contains some very upsetting elements. So Paula is abused, including sexually, by her father and is taken into foster care after he leaves her pregnant. And the book is narrated by another young black girl, the daughter of Paula's foster parents. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston is a very empowering book. This is the story of a woman learning to live life on her own terms despite the restrictions. So we follow our main character Janie through 3 marriages and see how she rejects the traditional role of the wife in each one. And then of course there is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which is about a dystopian world in which women are forced to become child breeders. One of the most interesting and notable things about this book that's really important to register is that everything in this book did actually happen to some women in some cultures, in some countries, in British history, to some marginalised groups of women. Margaret Atwood herself was really keen to point out that as horrific as the contents of this book may seem, it is all part of our history. So it's a really eye-opening book. So for some more feminist reading, I will link here to a video we made on feminist historical fiction, so do click through and have a browse, and I would also love to know your suggestions of your favourite feminist classics, so do put those in the comments below, and I'll see you next time!